We're back! After an exciting and award-winning first season, Top Tech Voices returns with fresh perspectives, deeper conversations, and even more inspiring voices from across the industry. This season, we're diving into how technology actually serves people, because innovation has the greatest value when it improves lives, protects what matters, and solves real human challenges. Right? So whether you're tuning in from your desk, lab, or on the go, we're bringing thought-provoking insights, expert interviews, and behind-the-scenes stories that matter. So let's get into it, the latest season of discovery, dialogue, and inspiration. My next guest is an architect and engineer who sits at the crossroads of urban planning, sensing technology, and design. As MIT Professor of the Practice of Urban Technologies, he's been named one of Fast Company's 50 most influential designers in America and Wired's People Who Will Change the World. One of the most cited scholars in his field, he explores how data and digital technology can reshape cities, making urban life not just smarter, but more human and in tune with nature. It's a real honor to be joined on this episode by Carlo Ratti. So I've heard on the grapevine that you're a massive hippie. Is that true?
No, I don't think it is true, but I grew up actually in the middle of, in the countryside. I think my family, yes, perhaps you could define my family a little bit like hippie. And so a lot of years I've been spending in the countryside. I mean, living in a kind of pre-industrial, pre-technological world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you talk a lot about using technology to get us closer to nature and the relationship between architecture and nature. And when I read about your father was an organic farmer, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
he first was in technology as well. He did a PhD in the United States, and then he has been teaching applied geophysics at Politecnico di Torino, at the Technical University in Torino. But then, yes, he became one of the first organic farmers in Italy. So really moving back to the countryside, and my sister and I follow him in a lot of that.
Yeah, because I couldn't help but think when I was reading about your work and, the relationship between nature and building structures and cities, that it must have been informed by that.
It has been informed by that. It probably also was informed a little bit by the opposite. Everybody then is a teenager, is a little bit rebellious. And so I think also my passion for technology, that's also in the work we do, is part of that. But, to me, the interesting thing is that when you look at technology today, really can help us to blend better with nature, to do an architecture that becomes almost alive, that senses and responds in a way that becomes like a living being.
Yeah, you've done some really interesting work around that at MIT, right?
We do that here. So we do that at MIT. We do the research part with Sensible City Lab. It's a lab at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But we got also a number of labs around the world in different cities, in Seoul, in Dubai, in Amsterdam, in Rio, and so on. Because we find it's very important to have a connection with people, with citizens. To have this kind of feedback. And also that's what we do with our design office. That's less research, is more about how the same ideas can be turned into a building or into the master plan for a new city.
I know you think about it and work in it every single day, and you're really in the weeds of the relationship. But for people who are listening and watching and are thinking, how can you use technology to get closer to nature in your field? Could you just explain a little?
Let's start by thinking about architecture. And this idea of combining, blending better architecture and nature is a very old idea. And also, if you look at the 19th century, the 20th century, think about here in this country, think about Howard with Garden Cities of Tomorrow, was the idea of better integrating buildings and nature. Or think about the 20th century, a lot of, the utopias. Think about Broadacre City by Frank Lloyd Wright, or La Cité Radieuse by Le Corbusier. Some of the great architects of the 20th century were really trying to see this kind of integration between the built environment and nature. Now, today, however, is a different condition. I think at the time, in the 20th century, it was a lot of new city building was needed. Cities were expanding very fast. Today, the reality is that in most of the world, fertility rates are under replacement rate. So population is either declining already or it will be declining soon. And under those conditions, I think the challenge is different. It's more like, how do we bring more nature inside our cities? And that can happen in different ways. It can be nature itself, And we see more and more experiments in architecture, like, of nature colonizing parts of the city that before, were very different. But also, as I said, technology. Technology means sensing, actuating. A building with technology, with intelligence, with AI and so on, is a building that starts responding to the condition outside. It can be weather, it can be people, and so on. And so somehow, it's almost moving and becoming little by little almost alive.
There's so many things to pick up on in that answer. Let me start with the first. You mentioned that the birth rate is declining and we're seeing the population drop. How does that relate to integrating more nature into our cities?
About the population is this year I was the director of the Venice Biennale. The Venice Biennale every 2 years is it's kind of big, the oldest biennale on the planet. This big event where a lot of people from architecture and planning are there. And we really started with population. If you climate and population, two key variables. How is climate changing and population? And as I said, population is not yet declining globally. We still know that globally population is still going up. But we know we are close to peak population. And so at the beginning of the Biennale this year, it was this big installation called The Other Side of the Hill, bringing together people from many disciplines, physicists like Jeffrey West, biologists like Roberto Colter, uh, critics such as Beatrice Colomini and Mark Quigley, or the design of Patricio Urquiola. So all working together to explore this, the other side of the hill, after this kind of big growth of population that was in the Biennale like a hill, what happens next? And anyway, so those are the two parameters for our cities. Now, under those conditions, as I was saying, it's a different way to think about the city. Not anymore the city that expands outward, like in the 20th century, and then somehow tries to blend with nature, but ultimately, as we saw in the past century, can result in the destruction of nature outside. But the opposite is about, if you don't need to expand the city anymore, how can we let nature into the city in a better way? How we can rethink our cities again as more adaptive systems, also thanks to technology, so we can adapt to a changing climate and a changing planet.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about. When you're designing cities, you're thinking about the next couple of generations that are coming, and you're thinking about technological innovation, and you're thinking about climate change. So there's many questions. But you mentioned Venice, and I know you are very forward thinking in your use of technology. How have they been using technology there to become kind of more resistant to the climate around them?
I think Venice is very interesting. So this year, the Biennale really turned Venice almost into a living lab. The Biennale title, Intelligence, Natural Artificial Collective, is about how to use different forms of intelligence in order to, again, face a changing climate and a changing planet. And if you look at that, Venice is really one of the most fragile cities in the face of a changing climate. 10 years ago, a lot of people were leaving Venice because of what's called acqua alta. Acqua alta is high water in the city, and that's the difficulty is compounded by rising sea levels, plus the fact that actually the whole city is kind of little by little moving downwards. And so a combination of that was making the city almost impossible to inhabit on the ground level, and people were leaving Venice. A lot of the city was really in a very bad condition. 5 years ago, exactly, almost to this day, a new system opened called the MOSE. MOSE are kind of mechanical dams. Quite an ingenious system. It's a system that was kind of designed in the middle of the past century. MIT contributed to that as well. And that's both like a mechanical system of dams closing when water becomes too high, but it's also more like a cyber physical system, what you would call in a technical way a cyber physical system, which is a system that has a lot of input coming from data, real-time data about climate, about so on, and then a lot of actuation. So basically, based on the local condition, response. So again, you could imagine the lagoon that it is already a living system that kind of is coupled now with this kind of cyber physical system that helps to avoid water, keeping water out when it gets too high. Well, thanks to that, that has really had a huge change onto the city. You could say almost like it has saved the city. It opened for the first time again in October 2020, 5 years ago. But now people are going back to inhabit the ground floor of buildings. They know that before it happened like 30, 40 times a year. You really couldn't go outside because it's called acqua alta, so everything would be flooded. Most of the city would be flooded, and you could walk, but it would be very difficult to move around and so on. And so that has been, I think, a very interesting example of adaptation, how cities can adapt to a changing climate. And with, again, climate having already changed, I was talking to the mayor of Paris the other day. She's preparing for summer temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius. And then, so temperature are something, too much water, too little water. So I think what we need to do is really look at how to adapt in both nature and technologies. And technology can help us adapt to the changing climate.
Did you mention that data has been really important for informing how cities adapt to climate then?
That is very important. That is important, first of all, because data means we know more about the condition of the city. So, and in this case of Venice, again, data can tell us where to intervene. But the other thing about data when it is in real time is that it allows us to have the system that again become like responsive living system. So the system of Mose, what I mentioned before, this kind of movable of dams, really works like like a living thing, getting all real-time data, models about the weather forecast, about the lagoon and the situation of the lagoon. And based on that, it then responds in different ways, not always in the same way, but in order to protect the ecosystem and kind of help to as I was saying, avoid water getting too high in the city, but more in a more complex way, really to enhance and help the local ecosystem.
Mm. And I suppose that data collection relates back to your work that you did at MIT about the idea of cities kind of talking back to us, right?
Yeah, we one of the first projects we did at our lab that was in the early 2000, 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago. It was a project actually for the Venice Biennale as well.
Mhm.
The 2006 Venice Biennale. That year, the Venice Biennale was directed by Ricky Burdett, professor at London School of Economics. Ricky at the time had a position I had this year of director of the Biennale. And then we did something that had never been done at the time. If you It's only 20 years ago, but in 2006, not everybody had cell phone. I think cell phone penetration was around 50% in Italy, something like that. And what we did was something that now happens every day in our pockets. It was about looking at real time data in order to understand the city like a living organism. That's an old dream of architecture and planning of how we can describe the city not only in terms of bricks and stones and the city we can measure, but what in old Romans we say the civitas, the community, the flows, this kind of living city made of relationships. And so in this project, we really use data for the first time to look at all these real time flows. Of course, at the time it was the first time ever, so everybody was very excited. Now it's happening almost every day in our pockets, just with a smartphone.
Yeah, I mean, it's really exciting when you think about how much data we can now collect in the kind of technological age that we're in. But I do understand some of the fears around the idea of having a surveillance state. Like some of your work is so forward thinking in using real time data to inform the design of the spaces that we live in. But I do get the concerns around data privacy. Have you thought about that in your work?
Totally. I'm very concerned. I'm very concerned about what happens every day in our pockets. I'm even more concerned about what's happening now when we are sharing so much information with ChatGPT, and that information, yeah, we're sharing it ChatGPT or similar systems, but we're sharing it online. There's a lot of opacity today. There's opacity in the data, in where it goes. There's opacity in the possible biases in the data. So I'm very concerned. At the same time, the data we're talking about now about cities, usually it's aggregated data. There's two principles we follow in the data we use. The first one is, yes, when you look at the cities, is less intrusive than what happens in our smartphones, in our pockets. It's more about aggregated flows. It's about looking at dynamics that look at a neighborhood or a metropolis. So the first thing is this kind of aggregation and anonymization that at the city level, it is still possible to do quite effective. And so that is one thing. And the other thing is that even in that project I mentioned before, we did at the Biennale, the Venice Biennale in 2006. For us, it was important to share something in a public way and get people's feedback. I think, if we are very transparent in the data we collect, in how we do it, and so on, and then we share it with people, then it becomes part of a conversation. So, and then, we can all decide, society, how we want to do it. And guess what? I think, they might also be different in different cities, in different cultures, and so on. So the two principles for us are, the first one is clearly anonymizing, aggregating that at the city level is still possible quite effectively. Is much more difficult if you look at the data you have, that's collected every day from our terminals. But the second thing is really to do this in a very transparent way so that this is then part of a conversation. And as society, we can keep on exploring how we want to use the data, what type of data, and so on.
Yeah, I agree. I think if people, users, consumers, whatever the population know that we are collecting data and we're open about it, they're going to feel a lot safer. But I just wonder, as technology has evolved so quickly, most people can't kind of catch up with it. So it might take a decade or two for people to become used to that. Do you reckon?
You're right, but the thing is fine. Then but again, if this process is open, and so then it is fine also at some points to stop, and then you decide you want a moratorium, for instance, or which is what people have been discussing about the AI recently. So you're right. Time is also important variable, but the key thing is about knowing what's going on. And to me, the big problem I have is that today, when you look at a lot of this kind of online data, well, there's so much opacity. You don't even know what is stored, what is used for, and so on. So I think that for me should be a key principle. I'll add something else, especially today with all these kind of new AI systems. All these new AI systems, you will have heard many people describe them as basically black boxes. We don't know exactly how they work, but basically you feed them with a bunch of stuff, a training set. They learn something, they keep on doing. And then I think those training sets should be much more transparent because that's given it's a black box, the only way to understand how that will work, if it might go rogue under certain conditions, is to really know what went in. And unfortunately, there's a lot of opacity on really the training sets and how data is, what type of data it is, the possible bias, and so on. So for me, the transparency is vital, and that's the beginning of that conversation. So as a society, as a group, we can decide what we want to use and for what.
Because you've been experimenting with AI in your work for a while, right?
Yeah, AI is AI now. When you say AI today, everybody will just think about ChatGPT, but AI has been around for a long time, and so we've been using AI as a way to analyze data. We have a book coming out soon called about something we kind of pioneer over the past few years called visual AI. So using AI to do something that people have done for centuries in cities, which is look at the appearance of a city to understand it better, and now you can automate it with AI. So yes, we've been using different types of AI, but we should all remember AI is nothing new. Even if now we're all excited about this kind of very narrow thing that we're using every day.
Because I saw it was a few years ago, maybe in The Guardian, and you used AI to look at cities, and you found, please correct me if I'm wrong, that we're walking faster and we're hanging out with people less, right?
That was actually more recently. It was only last summer
Okay.
in The Guardian. That was an article I did for The Guardian. It's based on a scientific article. If anybody's interested, a scientific article was published less than a year ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. And but I did like an op-ed in The Guardian to explain it not in scientific terms for a broader public. And just a little comment here is that, it's part of what we were saying before. I think, it's very important not only to do great research, which is what we talk about every day at MIT, but also to have this conversation. So also writing an op-ed or, doing a video. That's why I'm excited about our conversation. Is a way again to engage people and have a conversation, decide, and openly about some of these issues that have big consequences on society. So anyway, I did this little article in The Guardian, but it's based on a piece of scientific research. And what we did, we found beautiful video taken in the late 70s and early 80s in New York and other American cities by a great urbanist called William White. And William White was one of the first people to actually take footage in cities in order to understand how we use public space. And public space is very important since the beginning of cities. When cities emerged around 10,000 years ago, public space is really what brings us together. And the city is a beautiful mechanism to bring us together so that together we can be more than each of us individually. So what William White did in the 70s and 80s in New York was really look at footage annotated manually to understand human behavior in public space. And his research was wonderful, revealed new dimensions of urban living, but also helped protect, for instance, Bryant Park in New York and many other parts of the city. Now, so what we did, we found all the old footage by William White. And at the time, he was saying he was taking a lot of footage, Super 8 footage, and he was saying, that is fun, but the difficult thing is to analyze it. Today, you got AI. AI can analyze, what he was doing very painfully, manually, looking at frame by frame to analyze it. Today, AI can do in a minute for, all of New York and a lot of footage. So we looked at the original footage, and then we looked at contemporary footage of the same places, and we started comparing. And what we found is a little bit concerning, and actually we are now doing more research to understand it better, is that, as I was saying, public space is the core of the city. As we were saying a moment ago, public space is also, I think, one way to avoid polarization. In public space, there's a beautiful dimension that we don't have online, which is inevitability. Right? In public space, you need to confront people who might think in a very different way than you're thinking. While online, you can just block somebody, just your friends. You end up very easy in an echo chamber. Everybody says the same thing. You just stay with your friends who will never challenge some of your preconceptions. And so my point is that public space is very important. What we are seeing in this paper is that it is possible. It's losing some of that primordial ability to bring us together. If you look at footage in the 70s and 80s and footage today, you see that people walk faster, as you mentioned, that people meet less. You got, that when they're there, it becomes a little bit more transactional. Now, this is the first paper. It was an interesting result. We want to explore it further. And because that is really what a city is a mechanism to bring us together.
Mm. Do you think it's because the design of city has changed and that's why we're hanging out with people less?
Well, in this case, I don't think so, because if you look at this paper, we looked at places that more or less look the same today and how they were like in the 70s and 80s. Again, think about Bryant Park, New York, Public Library, other parts of the city that didn't change it much. I think it is more about how technology, the layer of technology, has changed. So you can see in all in the old videos from the 70s and 80s that people were going in public space to meet other people. So we're looking around and so on. And today we're looking at phones because actually information comes in real time through the phone. So I don't think it's necessarily the design of the city, certainly not in this case for this paper. It is more about how technology is changing the way we meet.
Interesting. When I read that piece, I couldn't help but think about the loss of community. And I feel like it's something that I'm feeling like I'm reading about a lot, like we need more community. And I wondered how you think about shaping communities as a architect and engineer.
I think you're absolutely right. And as we were saying, the city from the beginning is a community. And some people take cities for granted. But as I was saying a moment ago, cities didn't exist once upon a time. They emerged around 10,000 years ago when our ancestors found this beautiful way to, as you say, create community, to bring us together. The old Romans, we mentioned before the civitas. They had two words for city. One is civitas, we mentioned before, is the community of citizens. And the other is urbs, so the physical city. And in Latin, the two are the same. You cannot have one without the other. So the city, if you want, is the community, as you say. And then there's a physical form where the community is. And in the city, there's always kind of this tension from the beginning. It's about bringing us together, but also you find divisions. You find, for instance, ghettos in Venice. Well, the first ghetto is the name of a neighborhood of Venice where actually Jewish people had to stay during the night. And, that name that now we use globally in a different way, got a gay ghetto or black ghetto and many other type of ghettoization in our cities, but actually emerges in Venice, where almost until when Napoleon arrived in the beginning of the 19th century, the ghetto was a neighborhood where Jewish people had to stay during the night. And so in the city, there's always this tension between bringing us together, but also creating fault lines. And again, this is something where data can help us a lot. Today, even in our cities, we don't have visible ghettos anymore. The ghetto in Venice had a bridge and a big door that was locked during the night. Well, today, they're not visible anymore, but I think we still have these kind of divisions as well in the city. Together with Richard Sennett, with sociology research, Richard and I have been teaching at MIT for a while. And we've been calling them liminal ghettos. They're less visible, And again, this data can help us better understand them, better see them. This kind of invisible fault line that then, if we understand them, we can then redesign, we can improve the city, and again, go beyond divisions.
When you say liminal, you mean a space that's in transition?
Yes, but also a place that is also less visible. As I say, you could imagine almost different phases. The old ghetto in Venice was totally visible, was really like a big wall, a door, and the door would be locked. If you think about some of the ghettos that were studied in the 20th century, they were still visible to the naked eye, just because of the people there, the differences that were visible. And today, in some of these liminal ghettos, you don't see them just with the naked eye, but you need this kind of data augmented eye. Only data can tell you that, yes, there is kind of fault lines, and we all know them, parts of the city where maybe we never go, and because of different reasons. And, again, data can help us elucidate it. And then see how to go back with the primordial function of a city, which is not to divide, but to bring us together.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to ask you was it's so exciting in the AI age for how we can synthesize data and technically use it to make a real difference in cities.
Yeah.
I'd love to know if you've ever seen like a real concrete example of that.
Yeah, I would say many, and my favorite one usually, again, as I say, data means a new knowledge about the city. I'll give you one example. My favorite usually are when you just share data, and then that allows citizens to take action. Let me give a small example. One of the first projects where we use AI, this kind of visual AI, to do uh, to look at green spaces in cities. So the project is called Treepedia. It's still online. We started quite a few years ago, almost 10 years ago, and using AI. And we got many images from cities. Think about Google Street View or similar. And so we used AI in order to map all trees in a city. Believe it or not, but many cities don't have very updated maps, use different systems in, again, different parts of the world. There's different data resolution. So we wanted to have this kind of ability to compare green areas in cities and give this information to citizens. And for us, the amazing thing that as soon as we did this and put it online, we were flooded by hundreds, even thousands of people could reach out and said, I'm looking at my neighborhood. There's less green than in another city, another neighborhood. I'm going to use it. Can I have your data to go to talk to my mayor in order to? And so, this kind of thing that sometimes change happens just by sharing knowledge, in this case, data with people. And then people are empowered to do something. And we've seen the same thing in other projects. For instance, we have another project called City Scanner, where we've been collecting data about air quality in different cities, and then again making it public online. And again, people use that in order to go and try to enact change. So somehow data, if you look at this, again, is part of a feedback loop, and then can be an incredible tool to change through citizens.
Well, it sounds like you are sharing the data that you find for free. So, with that in mind, do you think open source is going to be really important?
Well, first of all, for free for sure. Also because MIT, like in our
Of
lab,
course, yeah.
is a non-profit. So everything we do is not
Hmm.
for knowledge and for humanity. So we'll share all what we can, unless there are some strings attached to the data that we have collected. But we'll. That's what we'll do. And yes, to your point, well, of course, actually, one of my first books published here in London by Thames and Hudson is called Open Source Architecture, because I think architecture has a lot to learn from open source, both in terms of hardware, but also software and data.
Mm. Can you expand a little bit on that?
It goes back to traditional architecture, to the fact that in vernacular architecture, you had a lot of these kind of feedback loops. And people, provide feedback and provide input, and things evolve in a much more natural way. Now, some of that mechanism has not continued during modernism, during the 20th century. And I think going back to open source, going back and leveraging networks today can really inject back into the design process that kind of conversation that happens in more vernacular architecture. And so open source can teach a lot to architecture, and that is both, again, when you're doing the building or when you're looking at knowledge more from the data point of view.
Yeah, and I wonder what if you wrote that book today, what that would look like, because we can get so much data, and it's if we're going to have to work together to face the climate challenge, right? And I feel like the only way to do that is kind of to share it. And I know you've spoken about how sometimes people don't talk to each other, so you can't kind of create change on a grander scale.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I think the book came out, I believe in 2013 or 2014 initially, and today probably both the ability we have to connect, basically digital networks and physical networks, and also the ability to analyze data would probably change a number of dimensions. At the same time, what would remain the same is that at the end of the book, then we're asking, and I say we because the book itself was written kind of in an open source way with people such as John Habraken, who was one of the pioneers of participatory architecture in the 20th century, and many others, Nicholas Negroponte and others. So they all contributed. And I think what would be the same is, I think architects can play a very important role as integrator. In the book, we call them like the choral architect, somebody who's able to orchestrate many voices. Architects are very good usually at um, bringing together, being able to engage in a conversation many different disciplines. And so I think that architecture have a key role, especially as we adapt to a changing climate and a changing planet, in be the disciplines that bring others together. That was also the hypothesis behind the Venice Biennale this year. And so if you look at all the projects in the Arsenale, like the one we mentioned before, they have many different disciplines, and usually with this kind of choral architect bringing them together.
Mm. Do you ever worry that the pace of technological change means that some places are going to be better protected, and so much further developed and resilient than others?
Yeah. Look, I got many worries, but at the same time, I think we should also have optimism. And the reason to be optimistic from a philosophical point of view, for instance, is what the great philosopher Karl Popper said. Karl Popper said optimism is a duty. And why is it a duty? Because the future. He says the future is not predetermined. It's not something to be predicted. The future is something we will build together, and so we can be optimistic because if it is in our hands, we can certainly build a better future. But yes, there's many worries. But again, the important thing is how we can share them in an open way, how we can discuss them, and how we can collectively decide where we want to go in terms of what our cities will be tomorrow or what society will be.
I like the attitude. I feel like um, either you've spoken yourself or people have called you kind of a rebel in your industry. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but what I think, if we're truly going to change things in this positive way, it needs that kind of rebellious attitude, right? And I just wonder, well, if we're going to do this on a global scale, we're going to have to kind of shake hands with a lot of different cultures and who have a lot of different kind of risk levels. And I just wondered if you had any experience of that.
Look, I don't know who called me rebellious, but kind of I quite like it. But I need to tell you, design or designing is inherently a rebellious act because it is about transforming the present, about doing something. So certainly modifying the status quo, which means, it's some kind of a rebellious attitude. It doesn't apply just to me, but to everybody who deals with cities, with design. Think about the word project. Project is about, comes from Latin, is about throwing beyond, and basically is about changing, looking at the future and changing the present into something different. Now, but you're right that there's also a very important cultural component. And again, the best way to deal with that is to engage people. You're right. Sometimes same conditions, but the results will be different in different cultural environments. I had the fortune also of directing the Shenzhen Biennale, that was a few years ago. And what we did there was actually expose citizens in Shenzhen to data and facial recognition, something that happens a lot in China. And everybody was saying, well, Chinese people are not too concerned about facial recognition. And then for the first time in Shenzhen, when I did the Biennale, we allowed people to get off the system to basically decide if they wanted facial recognition to happen in a public space or not. And guess what? Most people decided no, they didn't want to be part of that. So somehow, even if the assumption and what many people have been saying is that there's a lot of facial recognition in China and nobody cares. Well, what we highlighted is actually that a lot of citizens there, were quite concerned and given the choice. If they were given the choice, they would be they would opt out of the system. So it's one example of how, by creating an open system, we can get feedback from different groups and different cities and different societies, and can adapt design to what the local conditions are.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about localization of cities and shared spaces according to cultural values. What I was thinking about was the how open to risk certain people are. So, you might do something that's never been done before, and in one country they really want that, and in another they don't want that. And it's yeah, if you're trying to shake things up, you kind of have to market it in the right way. And I just wondered if you had any experience with that.
No, you're absolutely right. I think, but there's many changes. And this, what you're saying about risk taking is another one. I'll give you another example that I find always fascinating. We have both a base in Singapore and base in Dubai, and we love working in both places. And in both places, there's a lot of emphasis on innovation. Now, at the same time, there's different levels of risk taking. And I love this something like, in both places, you would talk about a project, can be a research project or like a design projects that we do in our office. And, they will ask you, okay, is this innovative? And, yes, it is innovative. And then you would get the same question in both places. And the question then is, well, have you done it before? Now, clearly something innovative you've done it before is not something new. So no, innovation is the opposite of having done. And then the answer is very different. Like in a place such as Singapore, usually if you haven't done it before, then people get concerned. While in Dubai, if you say, I've done it before, they say, I don't want it anymore. I just want something that's totally new. So somehow the same focus about innovation, but with different type of risk taking. And that's just, one example out of many of how things then get fine-tuned in different way in different cultures.
Yeah. I'm wondering if people who are listening and watching, and perhaps they might be designing systems for their business. It's very different to spaces and architecture, but what do you think they can learn from your work?
I think this idea that basically we need to come together, and it can be for adapting a city to climate change. It can be for a system like what we mentioned before about Venice and how Venice can survive with rising sea levels. Or it can be about how a company should adapt post COVID in the way they work, or can actually, adapt to a changing environment in terms or changing requests from clients. So somehow, I think the methodology is the approach is very similar. What is the same is you can look at the city, you can look at the building, you can look at the company, but it's the same mindset of bringing together different types of intelligence in order to tackle a challenge. And what I'm seeing today, for instance, at MIT, is more and more people. I find it quite interesting. More and more CEOs of big Fortune, whatever, 100, 500 companies, who are coming in a pilgrimage to universities such as MIT and try to see how to innovate. Because I think you were talking before about the speed, probably 100 years ago, you could have, if a company had a good product and so on, they could be safe for decades. And today you can see that you can go from zero to master the universe back to zero in just a few years. So this actually makes everybody more excited and probably also scared about having to innovate.
Yeah. I mean, it is scary because it's just getting so much faster.
You're right. And time is, as we're saying, is a very important variable, especially because time, if it is too fast, then society can have issues, as you were saying,
Mhm.
in adapting.
Although I guess it's also more exciting because you can test out your results a lot quicker than you used to be able to.
Absolutely. And that's actually what some people are saying these very days. For instance, in China, where the market is bigger in some technology sectors, then you can have more iterations and faster than what you can do in a smaller market like Europe or the United States. But you're absolutely right. That is exciting in terms of, on the one hand, it is exciting. Think about this like an evolutionary system is like, mutations in nature. You can try more things and see what works and what doesn't. At the same time, we need to make sure that actually society can cope with the pace of change.
Mhm. And it's almost the more tech we get, I feel like the more collectively we're looking to nature for lessons.
I think I would say yes. I think the exciting thing, probably in different ways. In one way, is looking at the logic of nature, and the logic of nature is the same logic you got behind Silicon Valley, right? You try many things at the beginning; it's very risky. Nature takes a lot of risk with mutations, and then you see what works, what doesn't. Is the logic of Silicon Valley? Is the logic of academic research? So it's really both nature itself. There's somehow our willingness to be closer to nature, but also, as you're saying, is learning from the logic of nature, this kind of logic of trial and error, this logic of feedback and listening.
Mm. What do you think engineers and people who work in electronics who are listening can learn from nature to inform their practice?
Look, I would say that a lot of what many of the people who work in this space, they can almost be enabler in creating systems that again are very similar to natural systems. And again, we were saying before we use the word cyber physical, it's a bit technical, but it's a system where you use electronics, data, sensors, and actuator to create these feedback loops, and feedback loops that actually work together with whatever your scale is. It can be a building that becomes intelligence, it can be a city, it can be a broader ecosystem also involved in nature. So somehow, again, they could be the enablers of a more responsive built environment.
Really interesting. So, how have you used data to inform urban management?
Oh, well, that can be done in many different ways. But let me give one example. A few years ago, we got very interested in waste management. Something that always bothered me is that, we don't have systems that are fully circular. We still send a lot of things to landfill. And when we throw away things, we don't know anything about it. We know everything today about how things are made. The global supply chain is very well known and understood. But we know very little to what happens to things when we stop using them, when we sell them and somebody will throw them away. Especially electronics. We know electronics sometimes ends up where it shouldn't and pollutes our environment in our countries, or maybe sometimes shipped abroad. And so what we decided was to develop little chips, little tags to put on waste and start following. And we did a big experiment in Seattle, in the United States. 500 people came, 3,000 pieces of trash. We put a little tag and started following. It was a big surprise. We collaborated with some of the big waste management firms in the United States, and they had no clue of some of these flows because everybody does a small part of understands and knows a small part of this kind of management system, but nobody had traced the whole thing. And so out of that project, for instance, we got a lot of insights. Some of the companies working on waste management, decided to optimize some of the thing. Sometimes we realize we are putting more energy into moving things around than what we'll be able to get out of recycling. So somehow this idea that, again, data and sensors and data, if deployed correctly, can tell us a lot about how systems work, in this case, urban management, waste management, and then that's the beginning to do better design.
Yeah, that's a great example. You can only change what you know.
Exactly. So, and data is a way to know about our cities and dimensions of our cities that we couldn't even imagine just a few years ago. Again, we could look at the city as a physical thing, but today we can look at the city of flows thanks to all this kind of real time information.
So, what is next for you? Because you're doing a lot of things. You're at MIT, but you have studios all around the world, and it's important for you to collect data globally. Like, what's getting you really excited about, and what's kind of on the horizon?
But look, yes, we have different operations, but what we're doing is only one thing, which is we're passionate about the built environment. Built environment, as we were saying before, it's is also what brings us together. Uh, Cities are the community. Said before, and then we're passionate about the built environment, and so we look at that from the point of view of research at MIT, or from the point of view of designing new buildings, new cities, new neighborhoods, which is what we do with our office. So I think we'll continue with this. We got a few very exciting projects coming up that also look really at this dimension of adaptation, the dimension we explored at the Biennale in Venice. And so about doing more of this. But as we were saying before, in this, technology has a big role. Technology is a key component. First of all, architecture itself is technology, but also high tech, sensor, actuator, and so on can have a big role in this integration between natural and artificial.
Also, did I see that you have some kind of playful startups on the side?
We also have we also, as I told you before, we look at the built environment, there's research, there's the projects, and then sometimes there's also another way to have an impact. in the built environment, and that's about, products or startups. And so we've been actually involved in a number of startups dealing with micromobility, dealing with also with data in the city and so on.
Yeah, was it a robotic bartender?
There's also that
Yeah.
was kind of a playful thing we did at the very beginning. But it's now one of the world's leaders in this space. But for me there was important educational component. The fact that a lot of people hear about robots taking our jobs. Few people have seen robots and or interacted with robots, firsthand. And so the idea here was how can we create again a system with humans and robots in something as simple as, again, food and beverage industry.
Yeah, and how do people feel getting served by a robot?
Exactly, that's very important. We did the same thing we've done in Singapore, where we've been working, and in Amsterdam, working on self-driving boats or self-driving cars. Again, having people engage with this, and then because it's part of what we were saying before, Isabel, we need to listen. Architects need to listen more, and that's about feedback loop with citizens.
Mm. Is there a particular technology that you're really excited about experimenting with?
Not super excited about the present version of AI, these kind of large language model. They're quite interesting, quite useful for a number of things, but I think they're probably not the way that will lead to the next quantum leap. At the same time, I think they will have a lot of impact when they will become more integrated with the physical systems. And humanoids, for instance, are now a reality. You know that a lot of companies are betting on that. Probably China is the most advanced country, but you know that Tesla and Elon Musk are betting everything on humanoids for the future. And so how intelligence, new types of intelligence will enter into things in our homes. Today they are in Roomba cleaning our home, but tomorrow, with humanoids or other type of systems, is going to be both exciting and something to really pay attention to and discuss.
hmm Do you see people interacting with large language models in physical spaces, like in the future?
Yeah, I think, well, for instance, in the Venice Biennale this year, we had for the first time with a bunch of humanoids, and the way to program them, we are also generating a lot of trainings. So we're using LLMs in order to help program them, and then let these interact with space. And again, is another way to blur the boundary, as we were saying, between natural and artificial.
Okay, well, it all sounds very exciting.
To be continued.
To be continued. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.